So like markets can have utility. And there are even forms of anarcho-communism that are market-based.
Oh, pain. Well, here I am again to explain things better than anyone else can explain them, I suppose. Even though there are many dumb fucking imbeciles who think I'm a fascist or whatever, the truth is, I'm actually not. In this video, I'll be going over what I actually believe, since people endlessly pester me to understand my ideology. Before National Anarchism is explained though, I'd like to point out that even though I'm not a fascist, something I've pointed out in my video, A Critique of Liberalism, Economic and Social, I like a lot about fascism, particularly its embrace of traditionalism. So, what is National Anarchism? Well, before I can get to that, we have to define anarchism, panarchism, and pansecessionism. Anarchism is a political philosophy you'll see promoted by many on the far left all over the internet and in real-life organizations, trade unions, etc. It can be described as a kind of socialism which seeks to abolish the state in order to eliminate capitalism. Unlike, say, Marxist-Leninism, it doesn't seek to establish a temporary state, a dictatorship of the proletariat, in order to end the capitalist mode of production. Marxist-Leninism establishes a state-socialist mode of production, where workers don't control the instruments of material creation, but instead a centralized administration known as the government does. Anarchism understands that the only way capitalism will be rid of from the earth is through that of state destruction. If the state is overthrown, or voted away as some parliamentary socialists and anarcho-pacifists believe will happen, which it won't obviously, then there'll be no more capitalists, and workers will be free to live out their lives, to labor, in accordance with their own wishes. In a more broader sense, however, anarchism is philosophy which opposes itself to all political hierarchies. To quote Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the first person to call themselves an anarchist, anarchy is the condition of existence of adult societies, as hierarchy is the condition of primitive societies. There is an incessant progress in human societies, from hierarchy to anarchy. It opposes itself, anarchism, to authority, to rulers. The term a or an means non or absent. The term archy is a synonym for hierarchy. The term archism is a synonym for hierarchism, sometimes used to refer to totalitarianism. So, quite literally, anarchism means non-hierarchism. The term hierarchism meaning the principles, practices, and authority of a hierarchy. In general, anarchism poses itself to bosses, landlords, headmasters, police officers, politicians, and any sort of involuntary institutions or practices. An example of something anarchists are opposed to, or at least should all be opposed to, in order to be ideologically consistent, is that of compulsory schooling, since it's based upon forcing children to attend educational institutions, entirely against their will. Anarchism might as well be called naturalism or voluntarism, since it's all about what happens naturally, without coercion, entirely voluntary ways of life. Panarchy. This is an interesting ideology, very unfortunately very few people adhere to today, but I certainly adhere to it. Panarchism is, in essence, live and let live, each to their own. Each society will be constructed for different demographics of people, whether this be based upon race, ethnicity, ideology, style of governance, culture, religion, rulers, or whatever. The mutual agreement made between all these existing societies, which people get to choose from, opt in and out of whenever they please, is that none of them commit acts of imperialism or colonialism, that none expand past the confines they've agreed to settle upon. To quote Paul de Put, the individual who coined the term panarchy in 1860, the truth is that there is not enough of the right kind of freedom, the fundamental freedom to choose to be free or not to be free, according to one's preference. Thus I demand, for each and every member of human society, freedom of association according to inclination and of activity according to aptitude. In other words, the absolute right to choose the political surroundings in which to live, and to ask for nothing else. And to quote him again, where he further elaborates upon what a panarchist world would look like, in each community, a new office is opened, a Bureau of Political Membership. This office would send every responsible citizen a declaration form to fill in, just as for the income tax or dog registration. Question: what form of government would you desire? Quite freely you would answer monarchy or democracy or any other, and once registered, unless you withdraw your declaration, respecting the legal forms and delays, you would thereby become either a royal subject or citizen of the Republic. Thereafter, you are in no way involved with anyone else's government, nor then a Prussian subject is with Belgian authorities. Anyone at any time is able to leave their society of choice. Some aren't given the choice initially, for they're born into a pre-established social order. They can, however, leave at any time they choose and join another community. These communities can be vertically governed, having a state, or ungoverned, conditions of anarchy. People of all political tendencies, with the exception of bloodthirsty neocons of course, will find their ideal society fashioned from the cooperative acceptance of panarchism. Anarchists, fascists, capitalists, socialists, Marxists, white nationalists, whoever, will have their own societies due to panarchy, because any society can be created to meet any ideological group's needs. Now onto the concept of pan-secessionism. What secessionism refers to is individual small groups, in comparison to the size of the state, branching off, moving away from the clutches of the state, to start their own independent, self-sufficient communities, free from the tyranny of centralization. More specifically, pan-secessionism is an idea developed by anarchist theorist Keith Preston. He states, Americans are divided among themselves, along cultural, regional, religious, racial, ethnic, and political lines. Yet, most Americans agree that the system, as it stands, is no good, and all Americans have a stake in resisting the corporate oligarchy that presently runs the system. Pan-secessionism provides a way for all Americans to unite against the common enemy, the system, and manage their differences at the same time. Simply put, we should all work together to attack our common enemy, and then go our separate ways. Pan-secessionism provides a framework, whereby social conservatives and counterculturalists, religious fundamentalists and feminists or gays, blacks and whites, Christians and Muslims, conservatives and liberals, anarchists and socialists, communists and fascists, libertarians and communitarians, family value advocates, and proponents of alternative lifestyles, yuppies and punk rockers, homeschoolers and drug users, militant men and gangbangers, skinheads and illegal immigrants, vegetarians and pro-lifers can all achieve self-determination for themselves within the context of communities specifically designed to meet their own cultural or philosophical stance or desires. The system uses these differences as a means of dividing and conquering all of us who are under their boot. The Honorable Minister, Louis Farrakhan, once remarked, "If we can't get along, then we need to separate." So, if you now understand anarchism, panarchy, and pan-secessionism, then what, you may be wondering, is national anarchism? Well, the term national in national anarchism refers not to nation-state, as in sovereign country. In fact, sort of the whole point of national anarchism is its opposition to nationalism. The term refers to nation in the original rarely recognized sense, to mean a tribe of people, people sharing common characteristics, homogeny, although not all national anarchist communities need be based around homogeny. It just means folk, nation, in its most broad sense. So, a nation can be a race of people, a social group who have many things in common, from politics to shared enjoyment of certain kinds of entertainment, to culture to religious faith, to whichever combination of these one wants. Like panarchy, different communities and social structures, which will inhabit autonomous spaces, will exist for different groups of people. This political philosophy, national anarchism, where different voluntary associations in stateless permanent autonomous zones without borders nor nation-states exist separately from one another based upon an ethnic, racial, cultural, religious, ideological, or personality-oriented nature, has primarily been developed by two writers, Troy Southgate and Keith Preston. Although early anarchist, one of the most famous anarchists, known for creating anarchist collectivism, Mikhail Bakunin, also endorsed what would nowadays be referred to as national anarchism, in his support for different associations of people clustering together based upon whichever characteristics they desire, including that of racial background. Troy Southgate is a former English nationalist who joined multiple far-right organizations in his youth, promising to liberate both the European working class and the white race. He referred to himself as a third positionist and had joined the fascist platform, the International Third Position, in the 1990s. It was during his time spent in the National Revolutionary faction, during the 1990s and early 2000s, that a racial separatist and traditionalist flame of anarchism arrived on a development. To quote Keith Preston on what national anarchists want, "Anarchists of the right favor the development of autonomous communities existing independently of overarching state systems. for the sake of maintaining the identity and ideals of the tribe, and therefore look askance at mass immigration, preferring instead community self-determination with full rights of exclusion. Matters of ethnicity and race are certainly essential to this outlook, though not exclusively or so in a reductionist way. For instance, a tribe can be a group of persons committed to a particular way of life, set of cultural norms or political ideals. The tribe can, therefore, be a community of ascetic religious sectarians, radical ecologists committed to the non-use of industrial technology, hippie communalists, homosexuals, neo-pagans, radical survivalists, racial separatists, or drug users. The alternative right is a genuinely diverse milieu of beliefs and ideas. This is in sharp contrast to official diversity, with its emphasis on diversity of skin color, genitalia, and sexual habits, but complete uniformity of thought. Keith Preston also gives a precise definition of National Anarchism, saying, "If I had to come up with a working definition of National Anarchism, I'd say it's a philosophy that favors stateless societies based on autonomous, voluntary communities comprised of freely associating individuals and groups, with an orientation towards decentralized, pluralistic particularism, human-scale institutions, mutual aid, and an infinite array of individual and collective identities, and self-determination for everyone. A nation in this context simply means a common ethnic, religious, cultural, sexual, or lifestyle affiliation, not a national state or national Calvinism, the same way indigenous people around the world often think of themselves as a nation. Kurdish nation, Sioux nation, Lakota nation, Abu nation, Yazidi nation, etc., even though few of any of these have states of their own. And a nation in this context doesn't have to be an ethnic group. Presumably it could be Star Trek or Star Wars freaks or fans of football teams. As opposed to nation-states, permanent autonomous territories will be established for different pan-secessionist groups. These can take place within open, underpopulated landscapes, to create rural pluralistic living where each individual social group goes its own way. There could even one day be a city built upon national anarchist principles, where people live in surrounding scenery nearby the city, and can visit it whenever they please. Both rural and urban living is permitted, because one of the most fundamental elements of anarchism is the liberty to live how one pleases. And yes, this does mean certain people would choose to live hedonistically, worthless lives, where they contribute to nothing greater and exist for exclusively selfish purposes. However, under statist societies, this is already the case with liberalism. Through the utilization of force, it has manufactured such a social situation across the Western world and its nations. With freedom arrives voluntary paternalism.
Well, I mean, specifically for national anarchists, what's the usual interpretation of the critique of hierarchy in regards to, how they view society?
Perhaps I'm, the left wing of national anarchism, but I would presume that, the general consensus is that anything that's involuntary isn't good, but you could have what you would call voluntary paternalism, which is for. It's basically when you enter in or out, you opt in or out, and you have the freedom to do so whenever, of say, a village, a autonomous territory, a city, whatever it is, and so then you have to abide by the rules that that city has set, democratically by the people. And these rules can be strict, there could be a lot of them, and if you do inhabit this area, then yes, you are forced to follow them, but you can always leave this area and go to another area that's just equally as good. It's not like it's a lesser quality, and you can basically select which rules you want. You can go to the community which has your rules, and that's one of the benefits of pluralism. So that's not what I would call a hierarchy, but it is, paternalistic. It is, doing what's good for the people, having rules that, don't allow for degeneracy and, bad behaviors to happen, and so on.
I think I see what you mean.
So yes, a national anarchist community can be very strict, and yet, simultaneously, be completely free of authority. Rules are not rulers, and rulers don't make good rules. Hence, this is why, in our current crisis of modernity, liberalism has created and sustains horrible, abysmal environments sharpened through the evil blade of capitalism that corrupts all culture, ruins the spirits of all its citizens. If anarchism can accurately be referred to as anti-authoritarian socialism, then national anarchism can likewise be called anti-authoritarian separatism. And this is partially because national anarchism realizes that statism creates the opposite of what the far-right want. The productions of modernity we witness today, the decline in cultural and racial homogeny, false associations between the races, which only exist because of the states present today. For naturally, people have the choice to live with their own ancestral folk, they would self-separate, never having entered into the same space as people of different ancestral types. If you one day create a large civilization or even something the size of a city, for the sake of preserving the homogeny in genes of a white population, the state, if it falls under its privately owned territory, will seize it, force such a community to incorporate different races into its confines. In national anarchism, entire cities, villages, townships, and so on will be racially homogeneous based upon the democratic will of the people who self-govern themselves, horizontally. But no nations. Never countries. Aside from the state forcing people to be together, nations as well commit the same crime. Once one enters into a state-defined territory, they're not permitted exit, that is, unless they pay a massive fee to leave, the antithesis of a voluntary association. So someone of European descent who grows up in, for example, South Africa, is in almost entirely black area, they're born into that place, won't be able to leave their country, because the land, what defines such a territory, is privatized. Nation-states are based upon private property, and visas, immigration documents, passports, etc. only exist so that the capitalists who privately possess such institutions, laying down the fees, can make massive profits. Someone in future Europe who will be born inhabiting an extremely racially diverse country won't be able to leave such confines. With open borders, however, the absolute abolition of restrictions on freedom of movement, an essential part of freedom of association, people who are racially conscious, including all present-day racial separatists, will simply cluster together into autonomous territories and cities that reflect their biological makeup. It's actually borders which permit for forced associations amongst the races, not prevent them. If borders didn't exist today, anyone stuck in a district or country they don't like, perhaps because of diversity or multiculturalism or the curse of modernity, can move to homogeneous, monocultural, and traditionalist areas of the world immediately, without restraint upon them by means of the state. The way ancestral foreigners and foreign cultures are kept out of national anarchist communities is through that of the democratic community, organized and decentralized, which prevents entry from outsiders it doesn't approve of. And whilst this happens, make sure to check up on the cultural and traditional tendencies of its insiders, its people, to make sure they're living life healthier and happier. Typically, a national anarchist community is a pluralistic voluntary association of people based upon ethnic, racial, and religious homogeny, which are monocultural, traditionalist, and identitarian. One which resides within an eco-village, environmentally friendly, green anarchist space without a state present. Now on to defining a state. How I define a state is almost the same as how Max Weber does, only in being a bit more inclusive, specifying things a little extra. A group or group of people, or multiple associations of cooperating individuals who form a ruling class, that being an established political order where they hold a monopoly on the utilization of force, violence, and control within either a geographically defined territory or in context to the people they're governing over, usually through the exercise of hierarchical institutions. For example, in the contemporary era, the state in America is a centralized administration which lays claim to violence, because it utilizes policing institutions to carry out violence, force, and control against its vertically governed masses, that are the working class, the poor, individuals at the bottom of the political pyramid. So an anarchist society would have no police force. Before people who aren't familiar with anarchist self-defense start freaking out, no need to worry. For almost all of human history, we've lived and thrived without states, what reactionaries refer to as good times, with police being an extremely recent invention. Instead of a specific squad of people dealing with crimes, rules are enforced polycentrically in a participatory democracy. Intervention occurs at random by means of the will of the masses. If certain people fail to intervene in violent affairs to prevent harm from occurring to others, then members of the community can exile or punish them for their vices. So, because of its communal living, where national anarchist communities will usually be made up of anywhere from 50 to 150 people each, though a national anarchist society can be of any population size, really just that it's more pragmatic and effective to live in small, communitarian, high-trust tribes, there is a massive reduction of crime. Not only is most violent crime a result of capitalism because of artificially manufactured poverty for the sake of enriching a few employers or wage labor, where everything or almost everything is privatized and people commit crimes out of desperation in such circumstances, but because of small-scale living. Members of a community have an organic incentive not to hurt others, because they care for other people, and they also don't want to be thrown out of their living space. Troy Southgate made an important remark on the issue of centralization, of statism, and its overwhelming negative effects on traditional pacts, on that of the tribal spirit. The fact that people have put so much power in the hands of the state has meant that the traditions and values of our communities are becoming eroded at an alarming rate. National laws and constitutions are a relatively modern phenomenon, and to suppose that humans are incapable of organizing themselves into close kin communities is to hand over total responsibility to the state. Think about it. Do you really wish to leave things to the businessmen, the politicians, the counselors, the judges, the bailiffs, the tax collectors, the landlords, the soldiers, the police, and the teachers, or would you prefer to see power, wealth, and arms restored to the community where it belongs? The less we depend on the state and its institutions, the more irrelevant it will become. Once it happens, of course, it will become superfluous to requirements and will be swept away. We fight, therefore, for the community against the state. And on the racial aspects of national anarchism, Southgate states, as far as the left is concerned, national anarchism is simply a form of generic fascism, or, according to some of the more paranoid theories, a right-wing conspiracy devoted to the subversion of the left itself. Needless to say, this interpretation is incorrect, and national anarchists are vigorously opposed to statism and reaction in all forms. At the same time, the national component of the term national anarchism centers on the fact that some of us are racial separatists. Needless to say, while we wish to form anarchist communities that are ethnically organic, we also oppose negative and counterproductive attitudes that encourage racial hatred or mindless violence. Race-based politics have nearly always been the domain of right-wing organizations, but the fact that national anarchists are prepared to address this thorny issue should not cause people to wrongly dismiss us as yet another right-wing organization committed to promoting white supremacy, because national anarchism itself transcends both left and right. We are not supremacist, racist, statist, or totalitarian. In addition, the German National Socialists and Italian Fascists of the 20th century ally themselves with large banking interests and betray the more socialistic aspects of their original programs. We are genuinely anarchists and proud of that fact. For some national anarchists, race defines who we are and provides us with an identity and exists for a damn good reason. Without maintaining this essential diversity, something you can find throughout history, the world will become incredibly drab, standardized, and monotonous. National anarchists wish to preserve the different races of the earth, and believe that enforced multiracialism ends with the dissolution of races themselves. For some of us, therefore, racial separatism is the only way that the organic balance can be restored. We realize that it is impossible to separate people in the large cities and towns, many of whom have racially mixed children, or wish to live among foreign populations, and neither should we attempt to do so. Indeed, we believe that the nation-states of the West are likely to collapse in the next few decades, and that our respective countries will begin to fragment along racial and cultural lines, so there is clearly no need to treat people inhumanely by herding them into camps or deporting them in the way that the Nazis and Soviets did in the last century, something which ended disastrously for those concerned. National anarchists must form new communities based on their own values. The maximum of the future will be respect for others and unity in diversity. Finally, it must be understood that the national anarchist movement is not a racial separatist organization per se, and neither do we believe that it is essential for everyone to accept this principle. We adhere to the principle of live and let live, and if people wish to establish multiracial communities whilst retaining the national anarchist label, then they should be permitted to do so. In other words, we believe that supporters of both monoracialism and mixed tribal communities can work together for the wider promulgation of national anarchism in general. The most important thing of all, however, is for each of our communities to be established with a unifying vision, be it racial, cultural, or spiritual. Separatism for some, mixed tribes for others. Ethno-voluntarism is reaffirming of that of natural associations, of that of liberty, which should rightfully and morally be granted to all individuals, regardless of their ethnicity or race. No one, no state or individual has a right to force you to be with them, to come under their grasp. You have a right, just as they have a right, to that of privacy and to that of freedom of association. And as a natural expression of this thought, you should never be forced to interact with people of a different ethnic group or race if you don't want to, because seeing you are free by nature, unbound by any authoritarian demands from others, you have the natural right to your bodily autonomy, to individualism. Thus, the right to individualism includes the right to collectivism. You should be free to live your own collective, not with collectives forced upon you. You'd have the right to move wherever you want, with no privatization of transport, of travel and housing, which prevents freedom of movement. Bosses, teachers, masters, countries, landlords are all based upon involuntary associative functions. Ethno-voluntarism asserts that one has the right to associate and disassociate from whichever ethnic and racial group one wants, to live with who one wants without any compromise to this production of natural law. As that guy T once put it, National Anarchism seeks to create post-capitalist, post-statist, volkish structures by means of succeeding from governments and private businesses to create new worker self-managed firms and establish a true democracy, not a bourgeois scam that merely calls itself a democracy. Self-employment, common ownership and control over the means of production. Anarchism seeks libertarian socialism in a world filled with privatized despotism. For a really long time, I thought white nationalism was the only solution to the racial integralist crisis of the West. I was a white nationalist for so long, thinking there could never be anything else that matched my interest. Then I lost sight of the movement when I became increasingly aware of its inactivity, its absence of creating actual new societies. There was never going to be an ethno-state. There will never be. I abandoned white nationalism when this realization hit me. When I knew that following along with the alt-right wasn't actually adding any positivity into the planet. My mistake was heading into intersectional leftism, into a racial integralist multicultural strain of anarchism. I thought there couldn't possibly be any other options, any other opportunities. Just, white nationalism or intersectionality. That's, you have to be an intersectional feminist or a white nationalist, and you can't possibly find a non-authoritarian alternative to what the right want. National anarchism, in its uniqueness, in its pragmatic approach to new ways of life, opposes itself both to white nationalism and intersectional anarchism. There's never going to be a white nationalist revolution, nor parliamentary change where we'll someday, somehow, vote in a white nationalist candidate. Absolutely, utterly absurd. Yet many on the alternative right have, unfortunately, fooled themselves into believing this nonsense. Perhaps, just perhaps, national anarchism is the only realistic alternative, the only way of achieving anarchism, socialism, and racial separation, is sustaining both proletarianism and traditionalism, because it seeks to create new communities independent of any state, of any political entities, and instead seeks to work outside the system, not within it. When I sat down and learned about national anarchism, even as an intersectional leftist, immediately I was on board. And all that time I spent engulfed by the flames of leftism, the intersectional development had vanished, in opposition to the statist despotism of ancestral cosmopolitanism, something so horrible that it has to be forced upon people via state, since very few to no people would live in diversity if given an actual choice. An anarchism freed of its intersectional and degenerative elements would make a fine hammer and sickle. Combine it with anarchist communism, that is the gift economy, each according to their ability, each according to the needs, and you've got a perfect society. For more on national anarchism for those curious, I recommend you read The National Anarchist Manifesto by Troy Southgate, or Tradition and Revolution, also written by Troy Southgate, alongside Keith Preston's book, Thinkers Against Modernity.